I'm fascinated by his reference to Isaiah, in that he quotes Isaiah 5:7 at the beginning, in regard to the vineyard of Jehovah host as the house of Israel. And in that, he's stating that in regard to the covenant, what man is for God is seen there in Isaiah. And what Hosea puts forth is what God is for man. He's this green fir tree. But it's interesting is that the last sermon in the collection of the expanded collection of Grace and Glory is Our Holy and Gracious God, dealing with Isaiah 57:15. And what's really, when you start to think about it, because that verse, Hosea 57:15, is really epitome of what he's trying to express in this sermon, The Wonderful Tree. It's all about what God has done in condescending and giving himself to us and dwelling with us. And it's the heart miracle of religion. And what this should mean to us then as those who are living out of that union. But when you stop to think about it, then in internal to the book of Isaiah is a movement then from one aspect of the covenant to the other. As you're moving from Isaiah 5 and 6 to Isaiah 57, and then those glorious passages of 60 and 61, in regard to this is what is at the heart of our existence as those who have been created and redeemed by the Lord and brought into this blessed union. And I think that it's between the lines a little bit, but that's going to be the movement of every book, in that Hosea himself might have the emphasis upon the one, but Vos will bring out emphasis of the other aspect of that half circle of the covenant earlier in that book. And so this is the organic nature of Scripture. So it's the wonder of Scripture that as you move through these separate books in themselves, they have this message, even as they're part of a larger prophetic message, even as they're part of the old covenant, even then as they expand to the new covenant, and in what has happened with the coming of Jesus Christ. And Vos is saying it's all one, and you have to start with God as the creator has established this covenant, making man in his image, and has brought about, after the failure of the first Adam in the breaking of the covenant work, has brought about the realization in the second Adam of this great promise. And so I think this permeates all of the sermons, permeates all of the writings. And I think that's why we love him, or we esteem Vos, because he's probably the most rigorously consistent Reformed theologian that has ever done this. He never takes his eye off the ball in regard to what the goal should be and what Scripture is saying.
Yeah, it's definitely something to admire and appreciate. How long is this sermon, Danny? Is this typical for Vos? I mean, you point out some of this in the biography.
Yeah, this is 7,500 words. Now, what I like to do with these sermons, and this is how weird I am, I like to read them aloud.
That's
And
not weird.
if you, because to get the sense of how it would be preached.
Exactly.
And in regard to, so his notebooks, he writes line by line. And so there's some sentences that are like 70, 80 words. How can you draw a breath when you're preaching to even get that out? And so I would pause at a comma. I believe that's what he had to do to preach this sermon, if it wasn't just like a straight lecture. But if you do it that way, the length of a sermon that the three of us would preach today at 30 minutes, 35 minutes, you get to about page 7, 8, or 9. You still have, 65% of the sermon to go. And so in that sense, and here's the other thing, the content is so rich that by the time you get to page 7, there is more deep penetrating aspects than we would probably put in 3 sermons. It's almost like every paragraph is a thesis. And so you're sitting there in reading the sermon, and you stare at the paragraph because you say, oh, he's so right. He is penetrated to the heart. And you think about what this means. But in a sermon, in real life, you need to go on. And so it's just fascinating to take that exercise and to try to do 7,500 words. I have never made it straight through. I have gotten to about half of it, and even then, I just have to stop. So maybe that's my goal after this gets done, is to practice out loud in a room by myself to see if I can do all 7,500 words and how long it would take.